Shabbat Shalom, everyone. So this Shabbat of Parshat Breshit, I'd like to address a subject which has become very critical in our world at this moment in history, and that's the subject of our human relationship to our own power in the world and how we understand the power that we wield in our world and in our society today. You see, in our divided and polarized times, we live in this culture war where we seem to have two completely different narratives about what it means to have power as human beings in the world. So what do I mean by that? The first narrative of power is one that understands that this entire universe entirely exists for the benefit of human beings. That it's all about us, and that we are the only ones, we human beings in this world, who have the wherewithal to fight off the chaotic forces of nature. We're the only ones who must sit astride the hierarchy of all life in this world and in our environment. And we have to take power for ourselves from everything else in the world, and that the entire world is at our disposal. And this narrative of very human-centric power is behind why there are those, particularly now who are in power, who believe that it is within their rights to remove any blocks to what we want to do for our own wealth and our own success, even if it's at the expense of our environment. This same group that's in power sees it within our wherewithal to be able to roll back environmental protections and to do what we want to our world, to our planet, and to our environment if it suits our human interests. And by the way, this narrative extends us beyond just our relationship to the environment. It really extends into all things. You see, if, for example, something like science says something that counters the notion that it's about humanity. In other words, if science comes to a conclusion that this universe is not necessarily all about the benefit of human beings, this narrative will lead us to deny that science and to deny that truth. And not only that, this narrative of human-centric power can also lead us to all forms of discrimination, bigotry, racism, and even genocide. You see, if it's all about human power, then if some groups of humans become more powerful than other human groups, that's good, because it's all about power and human power in the end. So they have a right to dominate less powerful groups of humans. That's one narrative that seems to be very prevalent in our country and in the world right now. There is, of course, another narrative of human power in the world. And that narrative is one that sees human beings as not the be-all end-all of creation necessarily. It sees us as incredibly sacred, beautiful beings with extraordinary power in the world, yes, but it also sees humanity as part of a much vaster, interconnected web of existence itself. That what we do impacts our environment, and what happens to our environment impacts us. It leads us, those who have that narrative, to want to protect our environment, as well as to create just societies that recognize the inherent humanity of all human beings, and indeed the value of all life on Earth in general. Two completely different narratives of what it means to have power. Now, I'd like to believe that most of us who are gathered here right now subscribe to the latter notion of what it means to have human power. And in fact, many of us might even turn to our Jewish tradition as a point of pride that our Jewish tradition provides us with all of the fodder we need to support this second narrative. Notions of protecting Shmirat HaTeva, protecting our nature, and Tikkun Olam, and justice and tzedek, all of these things that are so strong in our tradition lead us to this second narrative. But I have bad news for you folks, because if you look at Parshat Breshit, there is plenty of evidence to support the first narrative as well, isn't there? And I'm speaking, of course, specifically of the command that, or actually the description at first, that we are B'Tselem Elokim, that we are in the image of God. If God is omnipotent, if God is all powerful, and we are in the image of God, then we, human beings, are created with godlike power over nature. And if that isn't enough for you, the Torah in Breshit makes it absolutely explicit what our power is. It says, Pru urvu milu et haaretz v'kivshuha, that you should be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, and kivshuha. What does that mean? Conquer it. Conquer. There's nothing more militaristic or top-down power than the ability to conquer nature, to conquer the earth. That puts us squarely at the top of the hierarchy. And if that isn't enough for you, it goes on. It says, Urdu bidgat hayam ube'of hashamayim v'chol chayat haromeset al pnei adama, that you shall rule over all of the fish of the sea, all of the birds of the heavens, and all of the beasts that roam the earth. There you have that verb, to rule over. If you rule over something, you are number one. It's all about you, human beings. So this is a very, for those of us who subscribe to the second narrative, a very sobering and disturbing description that comes to us from the Torah. Very deeply patriarchal, very deeply focused on this very problematic notion of power. So what do we do with this? Luckily, we have our 2,000 years of rabbinic tradition that speaks to this. And this is very important, folks. So for example, we have the teachings of Nachmanides, who lived in the 12th century. And he talks about, yes, it says, Urdu, that you should rule over nature, but that doesn't necessarily imply domination, says Nachmanides. He says it really is about our ability to build, to uproot, to plant, to mine metals. In other words, as Nechama Leibowitz explains it, this is about our potential to use our power only for the good, right? As Leibowitz says, this is referring to humankind's conquest of the desert, I'm quoting, and his constructive and civilizing endeavors to build and inhabit the world, harness the forces of nature for his own good, and exploit the mineral wealth around him. In the words of Isaiah, the world was not created to be waste, but to be inhabited. It was man's privilege accorded to him by his creator to have dominion over the creation and to rule over the fish of the sea and the fowl of the air and over every living thing that moved. And what this means is, yes, there is something very important about this human beings at the pinnacle metaphor. Because were it not for that capability that we have as human beings, we would not be able to build cities, we would not be able to build healthcare systems, we would not be able to build technologies that can make life better, not just for humanity, but that could make life better for all life in the world. So it points to a dimension of our power that can be used as a very good thing, of course. The problem, of course, arises when you see what happens in our day and age, and of course in all ages of human history, when people feel like they can take that godlike power and use it for greed, for selfishness, for self-gain, and for personal power as well. Then you have something extraordinarily destructive. What do we do when that is the case? Luckily, we have another rabbinic voice from our medieval tradition, which I think is really brilliant. It's the voice of Rashi, the great medieval commentator. And he comments on, in verse 26, it says, Vayirdu bidgat hayam of hashamayim, that you shall rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the heavens. And he points out that verb, Vayirdu, you shall rule over. Remember, in Hebrew, in the Torah, we don't write the vowels, Rashi points out. So Vayirdu means rule over. But those same letters, if you do the vowels a little differently, it's Vayerdu. What is Vayerdu? You shall descend. Right? So either you will rule over or you will descend. What is he saying? Rashi is pointing out, and he's bringing this chop here to teach us that we're looking at a warning hinted at in the Torah. Either you use your capability to rule over nature for the good, or you will descend to a level beneath the creepy crawlies of the earth. You will collapse as humankind. There's a warning here that we do have godlike power, but we may not abuse it. Now, I think that this is a very fascinating little teaching that Rashi brings. Of course, this is rabbinic artifice. If on the simple level of reading in the Torah, it's not saying descend. But it's very important that in our rabbinic voices, we reread the text that way. That's a very important statement of Jewish values there. And that we take one word and opposite meanings can hinge on the same exact word to bring us to a very profound conclusion. And that conclusion is simply, yes, we seem to have godlike powers. Abuse it though, and the universe will turn on us. That's how life is set up in this world. To put it another way, it may seem like we have godlike powers, but in fact, there is something infinitely more powerful than we are at all times. Don't be confused about your power, humankind. This is what the rabbis want us to understand, because ultimately you can call it God, you can call it nature, or as Tom Friedman likes to say, he calls her Mother Nature, right? As Tom says, Mother Nature is not only all powerful, she's also unfeeling. Unlike that merciful God that most humans worship, Mother Nature doesn't keep score. She can inflict her virus on your grandmother on Monday and blow down your house with a tornado on Wednesday and come back on Friday and flood your basement. She can hit you in the spring, give you a warm hug in summer, and hammer you in the fall, right? So we are not, this is what the rabbis were pointing us to, the same idea, right? So if the Torah, in the beginning of the Torah, sets out this very patriarchal, hierarchical, top-down vision that puts humanity at the center of everything, it is the rabbinic tradition, 2,000 years of rabbinic voices reflected in Tom Friedman's words that rush into that vacuum and say, nah, that's not how we understand our world, right? Judaism, as I like to teach over and over again, is not defined by what it says in the Torah. Judaism is defined, but it is the rabbinic reaction to what it says in the Torah. That's where you begin to hear what Judaism says. And what Judaism says is, at the end of the day, it's not just about humanity. We have to work together with everything in creation to create the world that we all long for. And to hammer the point home, I'm going to bring you one more rabbinic teaching. In Pirkei Avot, in the Ethics of the Fathers in the Mishnah, there's the famous teaching, Ezehu Gibor, who is a truly powerful human being? Who's a macho man, right? A Gibor. Who is a truly powerful human being? It says, HaKovesh et Yitzro, one who conquers his Yetzer Hara, which is the impulse to be selfish and greedy and to take for yourself, to pursue ego first. And what is the verb they use? Kovesh. The same exact word that is used in Breshit when it says that humanity should kivshuha, should conquer the world. And it's no accident that the rabbis in Pirkei Avot use the same verb. What are they trying to say? If you think that you want to conquer the world, start by conquering your own ego. That's where truly conquering begins. Now, we're living in very, very dangerous times right now, right here, right? We're living in times where there are people who are in power and people who are seeking power, for example, on the judiciary, who are very much influenced by a very small, myopic, and heavily influenced by Christian fundamentalist readings of the Old Testament that only look at that very hierarchical top-down conception that puts humanity at the top and the whole world is at our disposal. That's the kind of mindset that wants power right now. And so now it is on us to do everything that we can. Number one, to make sure we're voting. Number two, to make sure that we use our powers and our skills and our talents and our money and our availability in any way that we possibly can. And I mean this for the good, to prevent that narrative from becoming the dominant narrative of this society, because it is not the narrative that 2,000 years of Jewish wisdom has shown us about what the nature of human power really is, and its potential for good and its potential for evil. So yes, the Torah does talk about conquering and ruling over, but what Judaism wants us to understand, that the thing that you have to conquer is your arrogance, and the thing that you have to rule from is to rule from justice and compassion. Shabbat shalom, everybody.